would we search for the type of pornography that we search for if we hadn't been presented with that kind of pornography? Some of the content of mainstream pornography is implicated in creating a situation where women don't have the same access to freedom of movement that we should. We don't have the same access to bodily autonomy that we should. That actually there are some forms of pornography that are infringing on women's human rights. Is the harm being created by these companies, a lot of these online companies, and what are we going to do in order to start holding them accountable for reducing that level of harm for users? If you get the guys that own OnlyFans, I will 100% have an argument with them. Women are feeling empowered on this platform. Like that's great. You know who's been more empowered by that platform? The guy that's earning the multi-million pounds. Where I think we need to push the conversation back is to the companies that are profiting off material that is having a level of social harm. And the harm isn't coming from what people are doing in the bedrooms. You know what I mean? The harm is coming from some of the influence that is having on our sexual expectations and our sexual imaginations.
Dr Fiona Vera-Gray, welcome to PoliticsJOE. How are you?
Billy. Yeah, very well. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Glad to have you here.
Pleasure.
Before we get into the meaty subject of women on porn, your book, how would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Fiona. I'm an academic based at the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at London Metropolitan University. I've been working in the field of sexual violence against women broadly, but sexual violence probably for about 20 years now. I used to work in a rape crisis centre, and then through that got into research. My research largely focuses on things like, at the moment we're working on a big project on rape, police responses to rape, but then as part of that, a couple of years ago, many years ago now, by the sounds of it, I started doing a project that was funded by the Leverhulme Trust into women's relationships, experiences and views on pornography.
And that is going to be the sort of central part of our conversation today. Your book, Women on Porn, deals with it and sort of the female experience and interaction with pornography. Mm-hmm. I think maybe as a starting point, why don't we go for why have women sort of been excluded from that conversation previously? Why this book now, I guess? Big sip of coffee, let's go.
Right. So I think, it's a number of, there's a couple of questions in that. I think the first thing, why women have been, a lot of the time, women's positions on anything are simplified. And I think that women are quite often put in two opposing boxes. You know, we have for the longest time had this stereotype or this idea of the virgin whore dichotomy, that either you are virginal, don't like sex, you know, very clean, pure, this, you know... Frigid is what it is now. And that being, in a way, a kind of honoured version of femininity, that you're, you know, this innocent, compared to the whore, which is seen as, you know, the bad version of femininity, but that can be put on women anytime they express any kind of sexual need or sexual desire. So particularly in terms of women's sexual lives, we've been separated like that. But not only our sexual lives, I think that you can look at stereotypes of women and they always play on these kind of two stereotypes, and both of which reduce women's humanity in ways that I don't think that men have their humanity reduced so much. That there is definitely a level of that reduction, but they don't have it so much reduced just into these two boxes. And for me, that's implicated on why women haven't been spoken to about pornography, because in one way, you know, this kind of frigid box is not looking at pornography, so why ask them? And this kind of whore box loves pornography, so we don't need to ask them. And so there's been no space for the complexity of women's relationships to it, that sometimes women move from one space to another space. Sometimes they're both of those things together. Sometimes they have a wholly different third position. But then the question about why now is, I think that it's fairly urgent that we actually start to talk about the realities of pornography in society, because it's no longer the case that anyone can say they don't have a relationship to it purely because of the prevalence of it. So whether or not you use it yourself, you're in a relationship to it because of its dominance in society, because your partners are using it, your friends are using it, your teachers, the teachers of your children, Possibly your children have seen it, your co-workers, the bus driver. We're just in a society where this is a very large part of the media that is being consumed. Part of that, I'm sure we'll go into it, is kind of the increase in access facilitated through the changes to technology. So I think the combination of those two things, the fact that it's an area that historically no one's talked to women about, when they have spoken to women, it's been about how do you feel about a male partner's use, for example, but very rarely about what does this mean for yourself. Combined with the fact that actually now everybody is in relationship to pornography, that it just felt like it was the time to talk to women and find out what they thought. And I think one of the things that I want to say at the start of this is I spoke to 100 women, but I'm very clear in the book, it was just those 100 women. So what I found was there were some similarities, but there were so many differences. And I don't want people to think that what I'm saying is these are the 100 positions on pornography, because that just replicates, again, this reduction of women. Actually, what I'm trying to do and what I hope that this book does is opens up a space for people to argue, to argue with some of what I've said and what some of the women have said, but also to find points of resonance, to create some personal reflection, just in a way to lay it all out and say, this is what 100 women thought. What do you think?
And I think it was that, speaking to those 100 women as consumers of pornography, that I found interesting. Could you tell me a little bit more about those differences that you just mentioned, the sort of those points of difference rather than necessarily the similarities that were there?
So not everyone was a consumer of pornography is the thing. So and the differences in consumption were really big. So you had some women who had never used pornography, but who wanted to speak to me because they wanted to talk about the role that it's had in their lives. And that role can really vary. So I had some women talking about the fact that it had been used in abuse. So women talking about the fact that pornography was implicated in abuse they experienced as a child or in sexual violence that they experienced as an adult. Other women talking about finding, particularly in male partners, pornography use and feeling that that was a betrayal, or feeling like they were being cheated on, and feeling like there was no space for them to talk about that, because anytime they tried to say something about it, people said, well, all men use pornography, what's the problem? Or you're frigid, you're sex negative, you need to be okay with him doing this. And then finding it difficult to balance those two things, that on one hand thinking, I do want my partner to have the right to a sexual life, I want them to have their own sexual experiences, and to honour their, again, humanity, their complexity. But at the same time, I feel really complicated about it, but I can't talk about it. So I think there were women that weren't consuming pornography that wanted to talk about it. And then for the women that do, there was a range of relationships there. So I spoke to women from 18 to the oldest woman was 70. So it was women who grew up with a combination of women who grew up with pornography in your phone, in your pocket, streaming, what we know of it now, compared to, some women that had torrent sites, downloading porn, that kind of thing, compared to women that just had it on DVDs, back to VHSs, all the way back to magazines, right? So it's like
wood carvings.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like the whole spectrum. And the different relationships that women had to that, from using it very, very regularly or very irregularly at particular points in their life, to using it kind of sporadically, women having it introduced at particular points in their life, again, sometimes by a male partner. Rarely were they the ones actually introducing it if it came through a relationship, but using it for particular times with a particular partner. So just the differences, I think, again, in terms of reduction and flattening, sometimes when we think of pornography, we think, someone either uses it or they don't. And what I found with women is it's more complicated than that. It can be that you're using it for particular times, for particular purposes, then you move away from it, then you go back to it. And I imagine it's the same for men. I mean, the other thing I spoke to women because I'm interested in women. I'm interested in women's lives. I think that's been absent from the conversation. But the same kind of work also hasn't really been done with men, who are the primary consumers of pornography. So there really is a space there that I hope, again, this book somehow opens up for men to start to talk to other men. I don't think it's my role really I don't think I'll be able to facilitate those conversations in the way they need to happen. But for men to also talk about, is it the same for them? Is it Is some of what I found similar for them? Is some different? And what's their relationship and the range of that relationship in terms of their own consumption patterns?
A phrase you also use is mainstream pornography. And I wonder if you could explain what that is and also perhaps some points of difference with pornography that's not mainstream.
Yeah, so it's really hard. So one of the big things about the porn debates more broadly is that they're often structured around binaries. And in a way, I mean, binaries are so reductive, but in a way, the mainstream versus alternative is another version of that binary. And actually, and it's, what's the word? It's not entirely fit for purpose. It doesn't entirely describe what's happening. So I probably talk about mainstream sites, hopefully more than mainstream pornography, but I probably do both. But it's more the mainstream platforms, because on these big mainstream platforms, they do host content that's taken from alternative sites, that's taken from ethical porn sites, queer porn sites, feminist porn sites. And what I mean by those kind of sites and those kind of producers, people who are trying to do things a little bit differently, so who are trying to show representations of sex and sexual pleasure and bodies that is different from the very heteronormative, heterosexual, predominantly white, very male gaze version of what pornography, when it was off the internet, when it was published pornography, the majority of that kind of pornography was.
Yeah.
And alternative forms of pornography have always existed, and they've always been a side market, a kind of, off to the side. And I think what I was trying to do here, what happens sometimes is people say, well, there is feminist pornography, so therefore we can't talk in any kind of critical way about pornography because, if you wanted to, you could be accessing this other kind of pornography. But particularly now, all of those more alternative sites, you have to pay for what you're accessing because they are committed to providing working conditions for those who are taking part that are equitable, and they're just a more ethical working model, right? And we know that within capitalism, those kind of working models cost lots more. And we also know that it's a small percentage of people that then use them. People still use kind of fast fashion, regardless of everything that we know about it, because we have now existed in a place where it's hard to go back from the fact that you can buy a T-shirt for £5 or £3, even though you know that that's not how much it costs to produce. You know that there's exploitation behind that. And I think that's the same with some of what's on these mainstream sites, is that, in a way, the fact that there's an alternative that exists, we need to be able to hold that but not get too distracted by that, because what I found was, again, there was a lot of women who were saying they love the idea of feminist pornography. They think it's great, it really should exist. They don't use it because it's just, you can get free porn, you can get a supermarket of porn, these sites you're paying for a subscription. There's a limited number of what you're able to access compared to the supermarket on these big porn platforms. So it's there, it's good, but there's not a lot of people accessing it. And I think for what we know more broadly for other markets, there's never going to be more people accessing that than the free product.
Yeah, I guess. Well, there are very valid conversations, right, about copyright and the way that the tube sites initially in their inception were basically just stealing content, right? And I'm not saying that the production houses that were making that porn in the first place are, bastions of ethics and morality, but they were actually ripping them off as well. I guess conversely, I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit, if we have sort of feminist porn on the one side, misogynistic porn on the other, maybe. And I'm aware that I've just created a binary after you said...
It's really hard.
But could you tell me a little bit more about that side of things, on the opposite side? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think so this comes back to research that I did in 2021, which was a different project, which I did with a colleague at Durham University called Professor Claire McGlynn, where we looked at the content, we tried to look at the content of mainstream pornography. Pornography is a moving target now. It's online. It is really hard as a researcher to research it because previous work would do things like go into a sex shop, select 50 of the top selling videos, and you could analyse them. And they're right there. You can analyse them. On these sites, it's really hard. One of the reasons it's so hard is because of the sheer quantity. There's so much, and it's moving all of the time. Another is because these sites conduct a really high level of customization. So you going on, if you put out your phone and went on, and I went on, we would be shown different things, okay? Because it would be based on our browsing history and everything that they think we are going to click on. So it's very hard as a researcher to try and say this is what people are being shown. But we were able to work with the Advanced Computing Institute, and one of the guys there, Dr. Ibad Qureshi, did this amazing thing with an algorithm, which I don't understand at all. We contacted all of the sites. We were able to access their site with permission, and we downloaded all of the content on their front page every hour on the hour for 6 months. And he was able to do the algorithm so that it was hitting the site without the site knowing we were the same person. So we were able to fairly confidently say this is the material that's being presented to someone who's never accessed the site before. And one of the reasons, I will get to what the content was, but one of the reasons we wanted to do that is because these sites, and again, I'm talking about the big, multinational, multi-million pound platforms who are profiting a lot of this, who are profiting a lot of not actually doing anything to stop young people accessing, not doing anything to really regulate the content. Whenever they are challenged, they fall back on this argument of freedom of speech, right? And they say, we are just a platform. We see this on other social media as well. We are just hosting the material. What users choose to put on our platform and what other users choose to watch on our platform is a matter for the users. And this is, and I'm sure you've covered it probably in the show, it's a real challenge to everyone who's existing at the moment to push back on this kind of neoliberal idea that everything is about the individuals and the corporations, government, have no influence in your life, because they do. They are shaping our lives, and we need to be able to hold them accountable when they're shaping them in ways that are harmful, particularly when they're harmful for marginalised groups, because that's, the sharp end of the harm always falls on marginalised groups. And so one of the ways we wanted to push back on that argument was saying, what are you showing users? I don't care what users are accessing. What are you showing them? What we found was that 1 in every 8 of the videos that they're showing on the front page to a first-time user contains something that fits the World Health definition of sexual violence. So I was surprised it wasn't more, to be honest, but we tried to be really conservative. We removed any material that was labelled as consensual BDSM, and I think ongoingly we've had discussions about that, and should we have done it and should we have not done it, don't know. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, if something's being presented to a user as this is a consensual kink, there is something a little bit different to something being presented to the user of this is, I'm showing you someone being upskirted, I'm showing you voyeurism, I'm showing you someone being sexually assaulted. We wanted to say there's a difference there. So how much of this material are they showing? And when you get to that, 1 in 8 to a first-time user is a significant amount. So I think in terms of the misogynistic content, a lot of it is about eroticizing existing power inequalities. So again, there's an argument for, this kind of taboo testing outside of things, but actually it's not testing out anything. What we're seeing is the eroticization of power inequalities that we know exist in society. So inequalities between men and women, with men being dominant, race inequalities with white people being dominant. We just see the same inequalities in society that a lot of us are actively committed to challenging, being replicated in this kind of misogynistic, but also heavily racist, often transphobic, all of the things that I think anyone who's interested in a just and equal society is committed to fighting. We see these representations in these kind of mainstream pornography sites, and no one's being held accountable for them because the sites are just saying, it's just what we're putting on there, it's just what you're choosing to view. There's no regulation because it's on the internet, so unlike broadcasting standards, advertising standards, none of that applies. So in a way, they've just been given free rein to push the boundaries of the content as much as they've wanted to. And it's being pushed because what we've also found out through this big experiment really with social media and everything is that human beings like extreme content. we click on extreme content. That's what we engage with. So that's what a lot of these algorithms have found, is the more extreme content they feed you, the more likely you are to go, oh, what's that? Oh, what's that? And we haven't yet thought about that, which we know for social media sites. We haven't yet applied it to thinking about the way that these pornography sites are working.
I'm going to revisit that point that you've just made, particularly in relation to sort of consensual kink and then the sort of that different, more political analysis to it. But we will come back to it later in the interview. I just want to, you argue in the book as well that porn has a social function. Mm-hmm. Could you tell me a bit more about what that means?
Yeah, so again, this pushes back on that idea that it's just a fantasy, right? So I think that for a long time in the debates around pornography, there's been a huge debate about, is pornography fantasy or reality? And it's been responded to in different ways. There's been, definitely in the 70s, there was quite a lot of work from feminists talking about it has a reality. There is a reality. For the people involved there is a reality. For some of those people, the reality is one of choice. For some of those people, the reality is one of coercion. And for some of those people, the reality is one of abuse. You know, you've been trafficked or you are being raped on camera, right? And we're not very good at holding all of those things to be true, but I think all of those things can be true in different ways. So I think the reality fantasy thing has kind of been threaded through it. Now I've lost track of what the first question, what was it?
It was about social function.
Yeah, so I think what's good about thinking about the social function is that it's not just a fantasy, right? So women were talking about actively going to pornography for things like instruction, number one. So women talking about, and that not always been a bad thing, right? So going on to learn, I wanted to know how to give a blowjob. I'm 16, never done one, want to find out what that's like. Going on porn to learn how to do that. Going on porn to see what it would be like to do particular sexual acts that you haven't done yourself because you want to test them out before doing them yourself. So going on looking for instruction. And so it started to have that function, particularly in the absence of sex education that actually does anything in terms of actually talking to people about why people really do have sex, not always for reproduction, and how you actually do have sex, not always in this, missionary position. So instruction on one hand, but also expectation. So women also talking about, particularly some of the younger women in their 20s, that have seen a lot of porn sometimes before they've had any kind of sexual interaction with themselves. So women talking about, and I again imagine this is similar for some young men, watching a lot of pornography before they've even kissed someone. And so and that's setting up what's called in the kind of academic evidence base a sexual script. So an idea about what sex is, how you do it, who does it to you, what acts are pleasurable. And so I had some women talking about things like, it wasn't until they were in their mid-20s that they felt able to say that they didn't like having their hair pulled because the boys had always pulled their hair and they thought there was something weird with them, the fact that they didn't like it because all the porn that they had seen, this is what happened, and all the porn the boys would seen, this is what happened. And so I think we can't anymore say that it's not necessarily a monkey see, monkey do. We're complex. Humans are complex. So it's not that simple, but we also can't say that it's not performing the social function. And the reason that the need for that function exists is because we live in a society where we are surrounded by sex, but we do not talk about it. In terms of the reality, there's still so much shame associated to talking about it, that everybody stays away from really talking about the realities of what they do and when and why. And then that big gap in the education piece that's been there for so long, and the constellation of that has meant that pornography has stepped in and kind of seized the narrative about what sex is, how you do it, and why you do it.
I find this point about fantasy and reality really interesting because my sort of like default position on this, I would like to think, I do think that most adults can distinguish between fantasy and reality. You know, if you watch Fast and Furious, you don't go, that's how I should drive. You know, and similarly, if you're watching two porn stars having sex, you're not thinking, that's how it's done. It's kind of, I'd like to think, and maybe I'm wrong here, that people are able to separate those two things from each other. And I guess maybe the point of difference that you're talking about here is when it's someone who's younger and it's someone who hasn't had the education I mean, very few of us have actually had decent sex education, so it's not just
now,
them. Yeah.
So, but I think it's not only people that are younger, right? Because I do think that you can differentiate those two things. But the relationship that we have as a consumer of media to pornography is different than the relationship we have to consuming other media, because we're masturbating. We're masturbating while we're watching it, and we're actually. And there's something about that relationship that's particular, and also something about the silence. So unlike Fast and the Furious, you see people driving every single day, not like Fast and the Furious. You were taught to drive very specifically by someone who taught. So you can watch it and you can be like, that's not how I'm supposed to drive. But for pornography and sex, we don't see the way that the vast majority of people have sex. And so there is something about consuming a lot of representations that can start to shift or influence what you think the vast majority of people are doing outside of your own private sex life, because unlike other things, we don't have access to how people are doing that in their life. So I think it's relevant for adults, but particularly when you're thinking about the inability to distinguish actually what sex should be, it's much easier once you've had some sexual experiences yourself. And that's definitely something that women would speak about, that it was into their 20s. So again, I think for women, historically, and I definitely found it with the women that I spoke to, it was one of the saddest things, really, even for the younger ones, is that women have a fairly shit sex life, particularly women that are having sex with men. Sorry, men. But for quite a while, really, until their 30s, a lot of the time. Because it takes a while for us to feel, and I'm speaking very generally here, but it can take a while to feel ownership over your body, because you live in a society that's telling you that your body is there for other people. To break through some of the shame about being a woman who has sexual desire, because you're falling into that box of virgin whore. And so it takes a while to feel that you can actually say what you like, how you like it, when you like it. You know, I had women talking to me about the fact that they'd been masturbating since they were 12, 13. And then the first time they had sex at 16 or 17, and then into their 20s, they wouldn't come, and they'd just pretend. And they never thought, oh, I can actually tell him what gets me off, because I know what gets me off, because I know my own body. But just felt like I can't do that, because we're not in a society where women are able to have more sexual experience than men. You know, even though the young men aren't, they don't know your body as well as, do you know what I mean? So it's very messy, I think. And when we think about some of the messages and some of what pornography is doing, we need to really make sure that it's situated within the broader social environment and the particular messages that that's giving to all of us. But when those messages are gendered, the messages that that's giving to women about sex, sexuality, and our ownership of our body.
I think as well, there's clearly like a neurochemical component to this, right? That you're talking about. You're there by yourself. You're masturbating. It's like that endorphin and serotonin release is acting has like compounding effects, right, on the thing that you're watching.
I'm a sociologist, so I don't know that, but I've seen a lot of research that's done with that and arguments around that, and some of it I have a bit of a. I don't know, but I have seen stuff talking about that you start to get addicted. You know, people talk about pornography addiction. And I think with the women that I spoke to, no one really spoke about addiction, but some did talk about some of that response in terms of it becoming quite difficult to imagine, to fantasize. So this comes back to the fantasy thing. It became quite difficult to fantasize without pornography. And that what they would do when they fantasized without pornography is fantasize images from pornography for a while. And I had a couple of women say that they started to feel a bit just not comfortable with how much porn they were using. And so wanting to go back to using their own sexual imagination. And that it took months to be able to fantasize themselves, to be able to fantasize without having these kind of pornographic images coming in or memories of porn that they'd seen. I've got a colleague at my research unit who's done some work with men more broadly on sexualization of culture. And she developed this concept, her name's Maria Garner, and she developed this concept called pornographic recall from the men. And she said that they were talking about, they would be walking down the street and they would see, for example, a woman in short shorts bend over, and it would remind them of some porn that they'd seen. And it was almost like an unwanted memory, like
impulsive
pornographic recall that just came back. And I think it's really important and useful way for us to again talk about how everyone's in a relationship to pornography, because that is going on in the minds of people around you. And for the women, that was going on when they tried to fantasize themselves. So I think, again, in terms of this idea of binaries, sometimes we only think about porn as kind of opening up your sexual imagination, opening up your sexual fantasy life. But in some ways, it also can restrict it or narrow it, because it can make it harder for you to organically make things up yourself.
To stick with the fantasy reality point for just one more question, I guess, if that fantasy does move to reality, and it's between consenting adults who are the things that they've seen in pornography or they watch together, and I'd for want of a better word, like play with each other, and like I said, consenting, it's part of their sex life. I mean, is it necessarily harmful that they do that the fantasy of it does bleed over into the reality of their sex life?
I think what we need to really protect is people's right to a private sex life, right? Like, I'm a big defender of human rights, and we have a right to a private sex life, we have a right to privacy, we have a right to bodily autonomy. And so I think all of those kind of questions, again, focus us on the individual. And where I think we need to push the conversation back is to the companies that are profiting off material that is having a level of social harm. And the harm isn't coming from what people are doing in the bedrooms. You know what I mean? The harm is coming from some of the influence that is having on our sexual expectations and our sexual imaginations. And so I think that's where I'm hoping in the next couple of years, and I'm seeing some of it start to happen, that's where shifting away from thinking about, is the harm being created by individuals, to is the harm being created by these companies, a lot of these online companies, and what are we going to do in order to start holding them accountable for reducing that level of harm for users?
This might be a slightly philosophical question, but do you think that the sort of the private is pre-political? That private sphere, the like sort of classic, I don't know, like Mills type, what happens in someone's home is their own business, and yada yada. Do you think that can ever truly be apolitical? Because okay.
I'm a sociologist, so I think we're no.
I just told you.
Yeah, nothing's. We're social creatures. We are shaped by society, and we shape society, and we can't get outside of that. And one of the areas that becomes quite difficult is when you're talking about sexual desire. And again, some of the women really spoke about this and were really open about it. I don't think that any of us want to think that our sexual desire is something that hasn't been touched by social forces, like it's ours. And one of the things that women were struggling with was actually thinking about it's not outside of where it's being developed. It can't be outside of where it's being developed, because nothing else of us, we don't know what it's like for us to exist outside of our social situation. And so I had women who were survivors of sexual violence, for example, talking about the ways in which they felt that experiences of sexual violence when they were younger had shaped their sexuality in a way that they were struggling to understand, because they didn't want to think that an experience of violence had shaped their sexuality. But actually, when they're kind of open to it and reflecting on it, they were thinking that it has to have played a part. And so I think that these are really difficult questions to have and to ask ourselves. And it's been made even more difficult by the fact that the space that people have when we talk about it is so full of judgment and stigma, and us immediately wanting to say, you were, you experienced violence as a child and now you're into BDSM, and there must be a connection between those two things. And people are just like, I don't, no, I'm not going to go in there. That's reductive. That's simplifying me again. And it's making it harder. Whereas some of the women that I was talking to were able to kind of think there's something that I need to be looking at here. I just need this space, this non-judgmental space to be able to think it through, both myself and also, I think, with other women.
Let's revisit the conversation we were having earlier about power dynamics within porn, and particularly that kind of heteronormative dynamic. To what extent do you think, I mean, we have this proliferation now where it's, yes, there's these huge tube sites, there are these huge production companies that are making all of this. We also have OnlyFans, where a lot of women are creating content for themselves, right? They're often, not with partners or anything like that. There's feminist porn houses that are making feminist porn. And I wonder if you think that that sort of proliferation is actually acting in a way to kind of undermine that pre-existing power dynamic. I think about OnlyFans on the one hand, and I know because I've interviewed women that are creators on there, and they will have told me, and they'll tell other people, I find this empowering, it's an expression of my body, it's an expression of my sexuality, and I absolutely do not want to be like, that's false consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. I hate false consciousness.
Yeah, I don't believe you. But I'm also very conscious that there is this ginormous corporation that is also making a great deal of money out of them expressing themselves sexually that way. So
millions of pounds they're making. This is the thing. And this is what I mean about pushing. I just want the conversation to start pushing back to the companies. So this was a couple of years ago. So I did the research before OnlyFans. I don't know if it was before OnlyFans existed, but it definitely was before it was a thing, because no one spoke about OnlyFans. But I did have some women who created their own pornography and put it on some of the mainstream sites. And I had a woman who at the time was using Tumblr, before Tumblr then introduced a no pornography thing, which was actually really sad. So one of the things I found out was that a lot of women were using, there was a Tumblr at the time called Porn for Women, and a lot of women were using that. And then it was really interesting, of all the platforms, that's the one that then
people say
that
when they stop pornography, it like ruined Tumblr.
Yeah.
Like, there's people it's mostly women that I've spoken to about it who will say like that was where they consumed porn.
That's exactly it, and that's the one platform where actually it then got stopped. So I don't know what's going on there, but maybe we do. But I think that I've forgotten again what were you saying. It
was about sort of OnlyFans and creators challenging that power dynamic.
Yeah, so this was a couple of years ago actually. It was the time where I actually learned, that you get to choose what media you do and how media will frame a discussion. And media, for a lot of my early talking around this area, wanted to frame this as an argument between me and someone who was sex working. And I did one once, I think it was on, I can't remember what it was on, and it was with a woman called Pandora Blake, who does spanking porn. And she was great, and we actually had a lot in common, and we didn't have the argument that they wanted us to have, and so I think it wasn't the kind of interview that they wanted.
They were furious.
Yeah, and then, but after that, I had someone who it was when OnlyFans did something, and they wanted me to go on with a woman who used OnlyFans to, again, have the same thing and have an argument. And that time I was a little bit older, I was a little bit more able to say, I'm not doing this. And I said to them, if you get the guys that own OnlyFans, I'll 100% have an argument with them. I'm not coming on to have an argument about what someone is choosing. My argument is not with you, you know? And so I think, again, some of that, it's again pushing us back, when thinking about, but women are feeling empowered on this platform. Like, that's great. You know who's been more empowered by that platform? The guy that's earning the multi-million pounds. And so I want to talk to him. And I also think there's that thing about it's paid for content. And so it's always going to, in a way, not increase the demand, but it's not going to affect the demand for a free product. That's just not what's going to happen. We know that doesn't happen anywhere else. So it's provided a way for possibly women who wanted to get into the industry but wanted to do it on their own terms. It's provided them a way to get into the industry on their own terms. And, that's great. But I think that, again, we need to hold that alongside still being able to go look at some of the problems in this bigger, more accessed pool of pornography.
What about as a mechanism, though, to kind of challenge that sort of heteronormative established power dynamic where you have sort of male as dominant, male as subject, female as submissive, female as object.
So I think it does. So, and you can get alternative representations, but again, they're not drowning out the noise on the bulk of this mainstream site, which is the bulk of what people are accessing. And I think, again, when I talk about that content analysis that we did on the mainstream porn sites, and these sites, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but they, again, the volume of people using these sites internationally
some of the most visited websites in the world
is massive, right? And so you think about that volume and the content. While we focused very narrowly on sexually violent content, there was also a vast amount of content that we didn't include because it didn't fit our inclusion criteria, but that was really problematic. So it's like, watch these dumb sluts get fucked, basically is the underlying message of a lot of this pornography. And whether or not people are like, well, that's just a fantasy, that is just reinforcing this idea that women get fucked, sex is something that is done to women, and women that do get fucked, that have sex, are dumb sluts. It's like, that's not helpful for anybody. And you could show the exact same material and you could call it something different. Watch these two women enjoy having sex. It's not a very sexy title.
I think it's very clickable.
I don't have a future as a copywriter for a pornography site. But just that, to me, tells me that it is framing our sexuality in a really particular way that isn't about what bodies do and what pleasure is. It's framing it in a way that reinforces things that in society we actively try and challenge outside of it. And that's why I want us to have a conversation about, let's look at it off the sites, because this is the other thing. When you're on those sites, they could be designed so differently, right? You think about Google, the homepage for Google, search bar, type in what you want. That's not how porn sites are developed. They don't actually care what you want. They want to show you as many things as they possibly can to get you to click on. And so what happens when you go onto these sites is there's a sense of overwhelm, right? And women would talk about feeling this, and you must have this as an interviewer, sometimes people say these things, you're like, oh my God, that's perfect. And I had a woman talk about that it's like a conflict between her pleasure and her principles. And so she goes on these sites, and she's not going to use the free content because she doesn't use it that much. She goes on, again, when we think about the social situation for a lot of women, we're busy. I mean, a lot, men, I'm not saying that other people aren't busy, but women are very busy. So we're busy, we're pushed. Sometimes if you want to just get off, you just want to do it quite quickly. Porn's an easy way to do it. You've got half an hour. You're just like, right, okay, I can do that, and then I can put the dishwasher on and do it. It's so banal, but this is what our lives look like. So I can do that very quickly. So I'm just going to go onto the free site. So she was never going to pay for anything because she doesn't want a subscription. She's not committed in that kind of way. But she would go onto these sites, and two things would go on. So one of them is that she would feel the sense of overwhelm. And she would find herself getting aroused to representations that if they were taken out of that context, she was like, I would be aghast at them. She was a black woman. She was like, I've been aroused by representations of race that have been really problematic, representations of women that have been really problematic, representations of violence. But I'm aroused. And then sometimes I've masturbated to them and I've come to them. And then afterwards, this kind of sense of rejection. So I had a number of women talking about, I would clear my history, even though I'm the only one that uses my laptop. No one else is looking at it. I would slam my laptop. One woman talked about throwing her phone over the other side of the room and feeling like a bit icky for a while, compared to one of the women who did use, she used mainstream sites along with feminist porn sites. And that's the other thing about that binary between alternative and mainstream. There's a lot of people who are using both. In real life, it's not necessarily that you're only using one kind. And she would say she used to use Erica Lust, who's one of the most kind of well-known feminist pornographers. And she would say when she used Erica Lust sites, she would feel proud of herself afterwards. And when she used some of the mainstream sites, she would feel shame. And she says this beautiful thing that she thinks that the porn on those websites is directed towards shame. And that's that watch these dumb sluts get fucked. That for women, for men, I don't know how men feel about that material. I imagine it must also feel a bit confronting because, you know, men have women that they love in their lives who they're not calling dumb sluts, hopefully. I don't know, some men are. No judgment. but that sense of is being overwhelmed, right? Because you're being fed all of this material. But for women, it's a particular because you know what it feels like to be called that. You know what it's like in your life, how those kind of ways of thinking about women have just reduced your life. You know what it's like to be harassed when you're walking down the street. You know how you can't go for a run at night. You know, all of these things. And yet you're still being sexually aroused by this material. So it's creating this real sense of conflict and confusion. Again, I can't remember where that started.
It's fine.
But
it's fascinating. And I have to remember, I want to come back to the two dumb sluts. We will talk about that in a bit more detail. But I'd really be interested to hear your perspective on this as a sociologist, which is, you know, I know people that are the most fucking right on, like socialist, progressive, feminist, outside of the bedroom, right? Or outside wherever it is that they're watching porn. And it's almost like there's a suspension. That's like all of my previous beliefs about exploitation of workers, about the male gaze, about whatever it is, put over there. It's like that's out in a box, and I'm going to watch some hardcore porn that does that. It's not actually it's actually undermining possibly these things that I believe. Right? It's complete the opposite end of the spectrum. What do you think is going on there? Is that just sexual gratification and that urge being so powerful that people are like my political beliefs, I'll suspend them for the sake of this? Is there like, run me through what you think that process is.
Yeah, it's really hard because I think it's probably different for different people, right?
Yeah, of course.
There are some people that are, you know, right on social who actually do hold some really, you know, problematic beliefs, and we've seen this, we understand this. But part of what I think is going on is that overwhelm, and I think that some of that, I would like to know if we would we search for the type of pornography that we search for if we hadn't been presented with that kind of pornography. So Catherine McKinnon, years ago, I went and heard her speak in Iceland, and she said this thing that at the time I didn't really understand, where she said most markets are demand-driven, pornography is supply-driven. And I was like, I don't quite understand that. And then I heard a podcast recently where they were talking about the opioid crisis in America, and they were saying it's supply-driven. It didn't exist before the supply, and then the supply created a demand, and then the demand creates a supply, blah, blah, blah. And I finally went, that's what she meant. That there definitely wasn't a demand for pornography before the market was completely flooded like it has been. And I wonder how much the content has been influenced by this flood, and that flood has then created a demand. And again, that idea of pushing it back to the user, that the user is then feeling, well, I've searched for this material or I've been aroused by this material, so therefore I can't talk about the fact that I've watched this material. And so that kind of, it becomes again that shameful, silent, personal thing, and no one starts to talk a bit more widely about society and what it means for us. There's a woman called Natalie Purcell, I think is her name, and she's written a book called Pornography and the Sexual Imagination, something. But she has this line in there that is about pornography, who are we if this is what we desire? And I was like, I just love it, because that's kind of the thing that we need to talk about. And so there's probably lots of stuff going on for people who are doing that. But part of it is, again, possibly not necessarily about their own, you know, the sense that we want to believe that our sexual desire is our own little thing. It's the ways in which it's been shaped. It's the ways in which our private sexual life is sometimes a way for us to push back on, you know, social norms and all of that kind of thing. But there's questions there to ask, and there's reflections to be had, and no one's doing it because there's so much judgment anytime anybody is trying.
So let's probe that question then, and we'll do it through the lens of the two dumb sluts you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are people in the world who, men and women, who that kind of language, that kind of dynamic, it might be, I don't know, two long-term partners who engage in dirty talk when they have sex with each other, right? And it's completely consensual. Maybe, I don't know, let's say it's husband and wife, right? The wife knows that the husband doesn't think she's a dumb slut. but she likes to be called that when they're having sex.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's necessarily, well, maybe it's just me that's introducing this moral judgment here, that it's, you know, is it necessarily a bad thing that that type of content exists out there if there are people that can engage in it in their private life consensually? If the actors that engaged in it were consensual at the time, if I highly doubt they've signed off the titling of the video, but let's say they did, and that we then kind of, are we ending up in a situation where we're kind of, people have this kink, that's what they're into, and absolutely all for understanding what's driven that, where's it coming from, why do you like it? But at the end of the day, if they like it, it's what they like, and who are we to sort of provoke that question, I guess, is kind of where I'm going.
So it's again this idea, I think, of people's private sexual lives. What I want to talk about is what the content is on the sites themselves, right? So what someone is choosing to do, what someone is choosing to privately fantasize about. But when the vast majority of the content is about, like I said before, this reaffirming of existing power inequalities. It's not transgressive, right? It is just, we are reaffirming and re-representing the same kinds of inequalities that we have in society, and we're sexualizing them, we're eroticizing them. And my question about that is, who does it serve to eroticize power inequalities that exist already in society? You know, it's not serving marginalized people in society, right? It's serving the people who are in power for us to all think, oh, it's sexy to call women dumb sluts, right? That's sexy, and that's for women to think that that's sexy. That's for men to think that that's sexy, and so there's something about us being able to talk about that without having to get drawn into, well, does that mean you need to censor people's private sexual lives? Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And it's really hard, I think, for us to do that, because that's the way the conversation has been had so far.
Yes.
And it's made it very hard for feminists. I mean, feminists have, as I'm sure you know, really divergent views on this, and they have for fucking decades, right? It's been a point of contention for decades. And I think one of the things that's important to say is that increasingly now, the sense that I get of what people think about feminism is they think that, you know, it's more divided than it has ever been. But feminism's always been, we have lots of disagreements, internal discussions, debates. And you have that in any political movement, right? But for some reason, again, this reduction, like there should be one feminist position on pornography, or there's one right feminist position on pornography. And I think that one of the ways that kind of sex wars things has operated for so long is it's been pitched from women who work in the sex industry who are feminists and women who work on violence against women who are feminists, and that those two have been pitched against each other. But actually, there's so many points of agreement with both of those groups, and one of the key points of agreement is this idea about, like, let's look at the representations of women, right? So it's about thinking, kind of pushing back, pushing up, and looking at who does it serve to have these representations of women, who's profiting off these representations of women, and what as a society do we think about that? I'm
so glad you made that point about discussion and sort of like open-ended questions. Yesterday, Judith Butler was sat in that chair interviewing her, and we were talking about this, like the politicisation of what is a woman, right? The way that Rishi Sunak throws that at Keir Starmer in relation to trans people, and she's like, you fucking idiot. We have spent decades being like, there is no easy answer. The point is that it's an open question. The point is that it's a debate. The point is we refuse to be defined in this simplistic, simplistic way. You write in the book that research on men's sexual aggression has shown the denial of women's human uniqueness is a driving factor for some men who commit sexual offences. And therefore the solution is we have to stop producing and consuming representations of women as nothing more than a conduit for the actions of men, stop watching pornography that sees women as endlessly replaceable, that sexualises coercion and women's non-consent. Demand this material is removed. So if that content either reproduces or reinforces those negative gender relations, do you think if we remove that content, we reduce harm to women? Or are we in a situation where we're possibly removing a symptom of harm to women, and that harm to women will exist whether or not that content is there?
Really good question. I think we just try, maybe.
What do we lose? Had to lose.
To be honest, I mean, you're talking to me at a really particular time. I'm slightly. I will get. So I'm working on a massive project which is on how the police respond to rape, and as part of it, I've looked through with colleagues about 1,000. Rape reports that have been no further actioned by the police, and have just read, pages and pages and pages of these reports. And I've worked in this area for about 20 years, and I've always had people say to me, how can you work in sexual violence? It must be so hard. And I've always been like, oh, it's actually all right because I get to work with amazing women, and it's not as hard as everyone thinks. But now it's fucking hard, and I am feeling weighed down by the sheer extent of sexual violence in society. It is massive. We have barely begun to touch the edges of understanding how many women this has happened to, how many men are doing this, how many of them are getting away with it. Just nothing, literally nothing is happening. And so I think I'm at the point now where let's try something. It's not going to make it worse. I don't think it can get worse, if I'm really honest, where we are. So let's try. It's taken a long time for us to get to the situation that we are now around the extent of violence against women, and it's not going to be a silver bullet. One thing is not going to stop it, but we need to just try to do as many things as we can to really send the message that women are not just there to fulfill some kind of sexual role for men. But we're just not. We're people. And it seems so simple to say, but I've just read file after file of women just not being treated as people who have bodily autonomy, who have sexual rights, who have privacy. And that's why I'm such a big believer of all of those things. And when I talk about pornography, it's not about people's private sexual life, but we need to think about, when we're thinking about the protection of human rights, protection of freedom, we need to think about the ways in which pornography, that some of the content of mainstream pornography is implicated in creating a situation where women don't have the same access to freedom of movement that we should. We don't have the same access to bodily autonomy that we should. That actually there are some forms of pornography that are infringing on women's human rights. We need to be able to talk about that and work out what we are going to do about that, and about the fact that companies are profiting off that.
It's a strange thing to say, but I always want to say, I'm sorry that you're engaging with that stuff, because it must be so traumatic, right? It's heavy. Really heavy.
It's never been bad before. There's something about, I was talking to colleagues about it last night, this is the first time, and it's something about the extent, and it's something about the fact that these are all cases that were no further actioned. They didn't go anywhere. You're reading them and you're like, he raped her. He 100% raped her. This is 100% what happened. And you see the gaps in our criminal justice system. And I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about whether the criminal justice system is fit for purpose.
Absolutely.
But regardless of what we think about that, there are always going to be some people that are going to want to use it as a site of justice, and they're just not getting justice. And the problem is so big that I think we need to start looking for things that we can do outside of that. And there needs to be a piece on education. There needs to be some thinking about pornography and how that's implicated. And there needs to be some kind of broader work about, I mean, you mentioned that you spoke to Butler, about changing our understandings of what it means to be a man. Because currently, all this idea that you need to be aggressive, you need to be sexually forceful, you need to be heterosexual, all of these kind of things are just, again, caught up in that's playing out on women's bodies, and it's playing out in sexual violence.
Yeah, I think there's some bell hooks that needs to be read, but I'm not that optimistic about how well likely that is. We've been talking for an hour, Fiona, and I've just got a couple more questions, if that's okay with you. Yeah. You mentioned about that in your previous answer, you spoke about mainstream content and the mainstream pornographic content, which has kind of been one of the main focuses of this conversation. And I want to talk about what it means if women are seeking out that content, and by the definitions which we've previously described it as, right? Okay, and I'm very I'm hesitant to phrase the question like this, but I'm sort of using it to pose a question to you, and not something that I think. But if women are seeking that out, does that mean that they are complicit in their subjugation? And I guess, more broadly, just sort of, what does it mean if women are seeking out and engaging with it as consumers?
Yeah. So it's a good question. It's a question that women are asking themselves. This is the thing. Women are asking themselves this, and they haven't been aware that there's other women asking themselves this because no one's talking about it. And I think it's a good question, and I think it's a question we need to ask. The idea of complicity, and you mentioned earlier around false consciousness as well. I hate false consciousness when it's applied to women, because when the women that I spoke to were asking this question, right? Then it's not like they didn't know that there was something going on here. And what they spoke about was a sense of conflict, that they felt really conflicted because they felt complicit in some way, but they also knew that actually they didn't believe what they were watching. It wasn't this kind of, again, monkey see, monkey do. It's not like they watched this material and then wanted someone to treat them like that, or wanted to treat other women like that. And so I think it's just, these are some of the questions that we need to ask, and we need to create a space to be able to talk about them. I don't have the answer because we haven't really begun to talk about it yet. But I think to be able to do that, we need to take off the table this idea of false consciousness. We need to take off the idea that anybody is not kind of complicit in a way in recreating the inequalities that we have in society. Every day we make decisions. We've been shaped by social forces that mean that we make decisions that might, in some ways, as a woman, reaffirm my position in society. We just do. And so I think that we need to be able to talk about it, particularly in relation to pornography, without this, well, if you watch that kind of pornography, you can't be a feminist. If you watch that kind of pornography, you must want someone to do that to you. We just need to take that out of it so that women have a space to air some of these questions that we have. Women are really good at talking to each other about complicated things. It's how we've been socialised. So we're really good at it, in a way that I think some men struggle, because you've been socialised in another way, which is you have to have all the answers. You can't be questioning things. You can't be vulnerable. Women have been taught you can be really vulnerable. You don't have any of the answers. We should be able to talk to each other. And we can, and we do. And it's just historically been something that I think we haven't spoken about. And part of that is because of this sense of, am I being complicit in this? Are other women going to judge me if I talk about this?
So if we accept that mainstream content, let's give it a try. Let's remove it.
Yeah.
I would typically associate that sort of, maybe call it censorship, and I would possibly associate that with kind of the more traditional sort of a right-wing politics, whether it's, offending like moral decency, outright outrage, things like that. And I wonder if you feel that there is a possibility that feminists could end up kind of in this uneasy alliance with, people with a conservative political disposition who traditionally not typically the ally.
They're not doing it for women's sexual autonomy. This is the thing.
Yeah.
And it is in violence against women, it's something that we have to be very mindful of. So a good example is things around child sexual exploitation. So a couple of years ago, child exploitation happened. It's big. It's a big issue. It was mobilised by a right-wing agenda to target Muslims, right? This big, all the papers, Pakistani men, there was a really racial and religious hatred got put onto an issue that was around violence against women. And I think the movement responded really well about being very clear that that is not the position that we are taking. This is actually the position that we are taking. And I think we need to do the same thing with pornography. And a way to do that is around this human rights framing, that it is very much around, I don't talk about censorship, I talk about regulation because it's an industry, right? So industries are regulated. Pornography, pornography is regulated offline. So if you want to talk about it being it's already censored offline. You can't buy the vast majority of what you can see online in a sex shop. You can't, because it's been regulated by the BBFC, British Broadcasting Film Classification, who have gone in and said, yes, this is okay, no, this is not okay. And there are some people who I think who are not far left, but who would say that the BBFC are involved in censorship. But this argument that any kind of regulation is censorship belies the fact that if it was offline, it already would be. And that it's an industry that needs to be regulated in some kind of way, because all industries are regulated. I think we haven't spoken yet really about the stuff around age verification. And there's loads of things to talk about in terms of that arena. But until now, like literally for, 10 years, since 2014, since we've had this kind of vast, free, streaming access to porn, the big porn sites have done nothing to stop their content being accessed by under 18-year-olds. There is a box that you tick. That's what they've done. And now them, and there are some other campaigning groups, are arguing that bringing in age verification is a form of censorship. And I can understand on one hand what they're saying, because they're concerned about privacy rights and the fact that to bring in any kind of age verification that's going to work, someone's going to have to provide their details to prove that they are over 18. So I understand that on one hand. But the other hand makes me think, how has this industry gotten away for so long making money off something that's highly illegal in terms of selling their product to under 18-year-olds? You know, and that needs some it's clearly an industry that's not interested in self-regulation. If we could trust them to self-regulate, then in a way I would be like, okay, that's all right. But in terms of the content analysis that we did, the vast majority of what we found on their sites was against their own terms and conditions. So we went back to their terms and conditions, and their terms and conditions include things like no simulated crimes of any type, no hate speech, no racism. And that's exactly what we found. So they're not interested in enforcing their own terms and conditions. So I think we can't rely on them to self-regulate. So it means that there needs to be some kind of mechanism that creates some kind of regulated market for them.
I think it's a massive unspoken thing in most of our conversations about adolescence, puberty, people's sexual identity, is the fact that often, well, now in the modern world, from the age of 11, 12, people are being exposed to hardcore porn.
Yeah.
I mean, I would struggle to name one of my friends, right, who wasn't exposed to it from like a very, very young age.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I don't want to trivialise this. I just, whenever we talk about age verification, I know there's all kinds of different ways of doing it. There's like people talking about possibly leveraging like the blockchain, or, you know, associate with a credit card. And then there's also the idea that like you submit like your driver's license, and then like your webcam takes a photo of you, and like someone in a call centre like approves it. And I just imagine this bloke like seeing like tons of photos of people about to have a wank, like looking down their webcam. Anyway, I'm getting off track.
It'll be interesting to see how it happens. And I think that, again, when we're talking about industries and big business, ALO, who used to be MindGeek, who are one of the major players in all of this, they created very cleverly something called I can't remember what it was called. They created an age verification solution many years ago when David Cameron was first talking about this in 2014. They created it, and they were going to sell it to the government. So they were going to profit hugely off the introduction of, you know, something that is supposed to kind of regulate the market. So they're not bothered in censorship as long as they're making money off it. Yeah. And this is, again, where we just need to focus a little bit more on their business practices and a little bit less, I think, on people's private sexual practices. Yeah.
Final question to you is about egalitarian porn. Whether it exists, what it looks like. Is there a world in which we can create sort of porn that's defined by equality, that isn't defined by the things that we're talking about?
It's really hard. So I don't know. I've read some things about can feminist porn exist, which I thought were quite interesting. Similar in a way to what we were talking about earlier, that we are infused by a society. It's very hard to get outside of that. We're not outside of the situation that we're in, even if we're critical of it. Things like egalitarian pornography are also going to be created for profit. Saying that, okay, so there is I do have an example of possibly egalitarian pornography that one woman gave me, which I don't know if the site still exists, but it was called Fuck for Forests. Have you heard of this?
No.
So it was from, so I love doing
Sounds
this
great.
research. It's brilliant. So it was from, don't quote me on this, people, but you can, I think it's on Wikipedia. If you don't want to look at the site, I think you can look it up. It was environmental activists somewhere in Europe set up a site where you could submit pornography of yourself, but and you had to subscribe to the site. They had the consent of everybody, and all of the profits, all of the money went into the forest campaign. So I think to have truly egalitarian pornography, it needs to be outside of the capitalist model. It needs to be not something that's being created for profit, because as soon as we bring that in, power inequalities, and so I loved that idea. I don't know what's happened with that idea. So I don't know if it's all gone horribly, horribly wrong and someone's been arrested for rape. So if that has happened, just ignore that I made that suggestion. But there is something about that. There is something about the fact that people were trying to do something different. I think that's really important. However, some of the things that the women were talking to me, and it harks back to your earlier question about women seeking out misogynistic material ourselves, there was one woman that said this thing about she almost needs a hint of non-consensualness to make it sexy. And there was another woman who talked about the fact that she's looked at feminist pornography and it doesn't get her off because she needs something rawer or more dirty or more base. And so there's something about you could create this egalitarian perspective, but is it that our sexuality is so entwined, maybe organically, maybe through social forces, but that it's so entwined with inequality that now it's very hard for us to find egalitarian pornography arousing. So I think there's lots of really big questions that we need to ask without the expectation that there's going to be easy answers. We just need to be able to ask them, be able to explore them, not get into an argument about it, which is very hard in the society that we're in now. We are just encouraged into these more and more extreme positions and argue with each other. Definitely within feminism, I think society more broadly. I think we need to get away from that just to be able to have an honest, in a way to take the narrative back from the industry, that they are sitting there very comfortable with saying, this is what users want. It's all about users. It's not about us. Don't look at us. We're over here. And I think we need to be able to have some of these conversations and ask, like, is this actually what we want? Is this what we want? And if it's not what we want, how could we make something that might be a little bit closer to the representations of human sexual desire that we do want? So, yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answers, but I think that we need to ask the questions.
Yeah, great. Dr Fiona Vera-Gray, thank you so much for coming in. It's been a pleasure to have you here. It's so insightful. Women on Porn is out now.
Cheers.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you.